Hello, everybody. Hopefully you all see us live. Welcome to Invisible People's very first webinar. And good thing I only had 2 cups of coffee this morning because everything was going so smooth. And if you've ever run an internet event or even a live event, when everything goes smooth, then right when you're about ready to get on stage or go live, everything just ends up going crazy. And that's what happened this morning. So, and then there was operator error because I started a wrong room. So Barb, Mike, and myself were in a different room, but Addie and Derek, who we're going to introduce in a second, were actually in the right room. So that's how we knew. Anyways, today we are going to do a deeper dive, more of an interactive conversation about the research, what America believes about homelessness. Most of you have probably downloaded it by now. Today, we have me, Mark Horvath, the founder of Invisible People, Mike Dickerson, who is the author of the research and also co-founder of Ktown for All. Barbara Poppe is the founder of Poppe Associates and former executive director of USICH. Addie is formerly homeless. If you guys are not joining our Sunday night live streams, Addie and Derek is currently homeless, both moderate our chats. And I just learned that the slides auto advance. Woohoo! Anyways, we're going to go through this. Addie and Derek are there to help guide you if you have any questions. Even if you have any questions on homelessness, they both are the real experts. So the introduction we're doing now, and then Barb is going to talk about how, advocates, politicians, stakeholders, nonprofits can use this information. We're going to go a deep dive into the information. And then we're going to, and they all auto advance. Great. And then we're going to Q&A, questions and answers. And if you guys want to hang out, we will do conversation, go into some invisible people tips and tricks. So years ago, why we started this research, the only thing I could find was this by Susan Fisk, professor of psychology, that basically, surveyed the public and said people basically view particularly homeless people as having no redeeming qualities. Think about that. No redeeming qualities. So invisible people, we're basically go off this belief that our inability to relate to homelessness, the public's inability, politicians' inability, is our biggest obstacle to ending it. These are messages that the public sees. Now I'm going to go them really quick. It's not really any particular one. I'm just trying to show that as the general public, we all get all these messages at the same time, and we need to coordinate. So what people see affects their paradigms. Nonprofits only show success. I took this photo. I helped house this woman. Nonprofits have to show success. That's a very good thing. But the public, after they see this messaging, see homeless people outside, and there may be a disconnect. Especially around Thanksgiving, you get, 1 million more direct mail pieces are, out messaging that all homeless people need is a meal. And that's one of the messages that the public receives is, all I got to do is pay $2.05 for a meal and we can end homelessness. There's a growing negative social media in most every large city and some small ones. The social media accounts are not just growing in number, but growing in popularity. They share content that I would never share. I think it's disturbing, but it's growing and people are really supporting these. And interesting enough, these negative social media accounts are using good story techniques. Both these women, they use video. I would never interview these women out of respect to them. But the NIMBYs are using very good storytelling techniques in real time, and that's how they're building a following. And there's messaging that we've ended homelessness. Now, I support functional zero. I'm not talking about the strategy or anything like that. I'm just referencing how messaging. So when the mayor of Atlanta stands up on stage and the media reports that they have ended veterans homelessness, and somebody is driving home and they see a cardboard sign, homeless veterans needs help, what do you think happens in the public's perceptions? Then, often we show data, show them the data. We, message data to people. You have major influencers. I mean, Dr. Drew, has millions of people that following him. In this interview, he was telling that the housing crisis is a hoax. He was telling millions upon millions of people that the housing crisis is a hoax, which we all know is false, that, we have a very severe housing crisis, but these are all messages that the public receives. And as collectively, we're all doing our own thing. And one of the things that I'm going to recommend that we need to do is look at it as a sector, very similar to how we do coordinated entry. Look at it as a sector, and then, figure out how do we better message? Because if somebody's doing good messaging and somebody's doing bad messaging, we're just confusing the public. And so now I am going to turn it over to Barb, who will undoubtedly do much better than me because she is brilliant.
Well, thank you, Mark, for that introduction. It's great to be with all of you looking across the list who's joined. How's that? I'm back. So Mark invited me to be a part of this project, and it's been one of my volunteer passions over the last year to get to work with Mike and Mark on this effort. And one of the reasons I did agree to help out on this project in some small ways is because I was just sensing the increasing frustration in all the communities that I was working in across the country, the increasing polarization, and frankly, a lot of confusion in what communities thought was happening to address homelessness, what wasn't happening, which those frustrations translate into poor public policy. And I think as you all know, I'm really committed to better public policy that moves us on a path toward really giving everyone a safe, stable place to call home. And so what I found in this research that was conducted was, first of all, it helps us understand kind of what people actually believe. There's not what I believe, it's what the public believes, which is really important to start. Secondly, it helps us understand that there are different segments within the public. And toward that end, also understanding that we don't actually have to convince everybody that it's right to solve homelessness and convince everybody of our strategies, but we do need to have a majority of people in our community willing to stand up and to be part of our efforts to improve housing justice, reduce racial disparities, and overall make progress in reducing the number of people in our communities who are living outside. And so through this research, I think it can help you point to what are the right messages to use, what are the right media to go to, and what are ways to present information that people can actually hear and use, and not get so defensive about it. Because if we argue about the facts, we're not going to be joined together in moving forward toward the solutions that we're all trying to do. So I found the research is just really fascinating. Mike and Mark did a fantastic job at pulling this together. And I'm so glad to get to listen to this presentation yet again, because every time I get to learn something from this. And I hope you can use this information in your community to craft joint strategies across nonprofits, across the public sector. And as we do that together, we can build the kind of change we're trying to make in our nation. Thank you.
Thanks, Barb. So I think with that, we are ready to get to our results. Thank you for that great introduction. And that's really exactly why we did this research, right? Our goal is to figure out these gaps between public opinion and expert opinion that can help us move things towards solutions. So as Mark said, I'm Mike Dickerson. I'm a researcher, writer, and advocate in the Ktown neighborhood of Los Angeles. So we started from the idea that public views drive policy and that we really need to uncover public attitudes, find the things that are driving negative sentiments that we all see whenever we have these fights over, citing a shelter or investing in homelessness. We wanted to identify effective messages that people responded to on this issue because it's hard to get people's attention. And we also wanted to deepen our understanding of audiences because we know we were talking to a lot of different people, and kind of how we conceptualize those audiences can really help inform how we make our messaging more effective. So before we get to the fun stuff, got to give you some of the technical stuff here. We surveyed 2,520 people. They were adults between 18 and 70. We chose the cities that are listed there based on a mix of high unsheltered and low unsheltered communities, as well as geographic diversity. Our goal was to get kind of a representative set of cities. And this is really focused on cities because that is often, sort of seen as the epicenter of homelessness. Obviously, there is a lot of rural homelessness, but the politics and perceptions of that can be quite different. People who took it were not employed in marketing or social services. We kind of wanted to avoid selecting for people who are very involved in this already in some ways, and balanced a census by age and gender. So at the top level, the public sees homelessness as very bad and getting worse. Almost no one believes we're improving the situation, and 73% believe that homelessness in their own community increased last year. Another 67% say that the pandemic is making this worse. And, I think that's something we all know. If you're plugged into housing discussions at all, you've seen the really terrifying predictions of what's about to come. And whether those are as big as some expect or smaller, we're still going to see some real effects downstream of that. We also wanted to kind of understand where people learn about homelessness. Obviously most people are not paying a ton of attention. And when it sort of comes up for them, it's coming up in the context of two places. One, when they see people on the street, whether that's driving by, walking by, and then also on local news. Local TV news has a really outsized presence in this conversation. We'll get back to that in a little bit. But it's very important. And then finally, kind of what the public generally talks about. When we're having these discussions, we're often talking about housing, we're talking about shelter, we're talking about strategies like housing first or functional zero. And that's not really what the public conversation looks like. Obviously, housing affordability, wages, these economic issues are a big part of it. But, there's really an outsized role that issues of addiction and mental illness play in public perceptions about homelessness. And that's kind of the first big gap between experts and the public. Obviously, experts are very aware of issues like substance abuse and mental illness, but often take a more sort of population level statistical view. And in contrast, often the most visible people, if people are primarily seeing homelessness on the streets, are the people who might be in crisis, who might be having trouble. And so it really creates this outsized perception of the role of addiction and mental illness. So when it comes to sort of homeless people and homelessness policy, there's a lot of ambivalence among the public. People have really diverse and contradictory views. Often we think about, sympathetic people versus NIMBYs, and there certainly is a dynamic. There are obviously splits, but for most people, they're kind of somewhere in the middle. It's a mixture of sympathetic views and judgmental views. But when you actually ask people about the policies they support, it's really the sympathetic views that win out. There is a huge level of support and really minor opposition in some ways to these positive interventions, things like adding permanent supportive housing, things like tenant protections, things like additional, medical and treatment services, things like shelters. The opposition is often very loud, but it is much smaller than the support. Some policies were more controversial. Sort of surprisingly to us, the most controversial policies were more policing and additional criminal penalties. There's often this perception that people are sort of hungry to get people off the streets, whether that's through housing or other means, but it seems like there really is a public sentiment that pushes back against some of those policies. And then we looked at sort of specific drivers of negative attitudes, and there were a couple ones that were very outsized. First is that NIMBY sentiment that, some neighborhoods shouldn't be involved in housing homeless people. Folks who believe that were far more likely to oppose shelter. They were far more likely to believe that mental illness and addiction were the primary causes of homelessness. Other factors that played into this were just views on the causes of homelessness in general. Again, people who focus on mental health and addiction, less sympathetic, less supportive policies. And then political leaning. Folks who are a little more left tend to be more supportive. Folks who are a little more right tend to be a little bit more skeptical of interventions. In terms of messaging, the public is getting a variety of messages. They're hearing about self-reliance or independence. They're hearing blame and judgment and quality of life fears, but they're also hearing personal stories, and especially stories of exceptional people. And so within that mix, there's a lot sort of we can do to help shape some of that. And so in looking at which messages were resonating, which messages people found credible, there were sort of two types of messages that really rose to the top. The first were things that focus on shared struggle, right? We have common problems. Anyone can become homeless. There's, this isn't a sort of us versus them situation. We really need to emphasize the ways in which housed and homeless people can empathize. The second were health and recovery messages, which are tied to commonality, right? We all encounter health problems. We're all scared of running into serious problems, having to go to the hospital, and homelessness obviously amplifies those problems, and treatment is obviously part of the solution. And so those kinds of messages can also help build that commonality narrative while also building support for specific investments. The broader goal, though, is building empathy. The big gap is often people's inability to relate to homeless people, whether that's not being able to see themselves in that situation, or whether that's an unwillingness to just go up and talk to someone like another human being. And when folks are more comfortable doing that, we find that they are generally much more supportive of the kinds of policies and solutions we need. And also that that's a way to sort of activate people, to have that counter to the often very loud opposition that we see. So in order to kind of look at audiences, we took a lot of the attitudinal things about homeless people in policy and used segmentation, K-means clustering. I won't go into the specifics, but essentially sorted people into clusters by their attitudes. And we identified four. Involved advocates, who are people who are kind of already activated. They are invested in the issue. They want to find solutions. They're very comfortable and empathetic around homeless people. Hesitant helpers are similar in terms of their policy views, but are a little bit more hesitant, right? They aren't the kinds of people who are going to go up to a tent and talk to someone. They might have some reservations about quality of life issues, but ultimately kind of come out on the side of more sympathy. Active ignorers are what they sound like, just trying to move about their day and kind of stick their fingers in their ears. And then our stubborn skeptics, you probably all know from loud people at public meetings who are, voicing very aggressive opposition to the kinds of things we need. But with these multiple audiences, that means we need differentiated messages. We need to think about the context and goals in which we're speaking. I can see from that first poll result that a lot of you are already deeply invested in this. That's kind of what we expected from the way that we portrayed this webinar. But, obviously in a different context, whether that's, a public meeting or a video that you're posting on YouTube or a post on another social site or, going to a school event or a church event, right? These are all different contexts, and we need to make sure that we're speaking to the audiences that, we're actually speaking to. So let's get into the meat of things. So, first, to get kind of a general level setting, we asked people what's happening in their communities. And as you can see here, the vast majority see homelessness increasing, and very few, about 5%, think it decreased in their community. They also think that the pandemic is going to make things worse. And this kind of gets to the point Mark was making about success messaging, that when we talk about the system succeeding, this is the backdrop of that. This is what people see. It's their perception based on the information they're already taking in. And so it's important to be really careful with that, because it can end up hurting your credibility when this is the starting point for your audience. In terms of where people are learning about homelessness, you can really see the outsized effect of what people see with their own eyes in local TV news. Local newspapers are also relevant here, as are a number of other factors, but for the majority of people, those are really the first two sources they're turning to, and almost 80% of people are turning to at least one or the other. And what that means is that we're kind of starting at a disadvantage, right? There are these other very loud messengers that can have very mixed results. People have good experiences on the street and they have bad experiences on the street. There are local news stories that are really sympathetic and really supportive, and there are local news stories that really amp up negative sentiment. And so within that backdrop, we need to make sure that we're, sort of pushing back against that, and especially trying to engage with the people and institutions that are driving these conversations. In terms of the causes of homelessness, you can see that there are really, kind of three big buckets here, right? Drug and alcohol addiction and mental illness rise to the top a bit, but right behind that are things like job loss, personal financial issues, and housing costs. Obviously mental illness and addiction are part of that expert conversation as well, but you can kind of see here just how big of a role those play in the public's thinking. Almost nearly half of people are saying that drug and alcohol addiction and mental health issues are, sort of top three causes of homelessness. And that can really push away from talking about things like affordability, things like additional options, things like renter protections. And so when we're thinking about messaging, we need to make sure we're not just talking around those issues, but actually engaging with the public in ways that don't amplify stigma, but that do address the concerns that people see. This one's a little dense, but we asked people a lot of bipolar statements where they chose which they agreed more with. And we really got a mix in terms of reactions. So as you can see from that top one, there's really a right down the middle split between people who feel comfortable around homeless people and people who don't feel comfortable, who feel scared. Obviously, I think most of the people here probably think people are wrong to feel scared. But for a lot of the public, it can be very intimidating to engage with someone who they feel is fundamentally different from them. And that's kind of why this starting point of empathy is so important. Again, we see sort of that 50-50 split in terms of whether neighborhoods should, or whether all or just some neighborhoods should be involved in providing housing and shelter. That sort of NIMBY divide. And that really is a big part of this, although we're going to get a little more nuance with that when we talk about audience. Towards the bottom, we have these less controversial statements. And again, really gets back to that point about enforcement. People don't like bans on living in cars. People generally are fairly sympathetic to homeless people needing to have possessions and own stuff, and don't really support going in and forcibly confiscating people's possessions. And so it creates a dynamic where there is a lot of support, but often that support's sort of latent and not expressed. So I want to preface this with the fact that positive response bias is a thing. People don't like to feel like bad people and are generally going to be more supportive on paper of policies they might not always support in practice. However, the split between support and opposition to the supportive policies listed here is pretty incredible. Obviously when the rubber hits the road and this is in your neighborhood, things get a little more complicated, but at the same time, at the high level, this whole range of necessary solutions, whether that's health services, whether that's direct outreach, navigation centers, permanent housing, or any number of ways to protect renters. These are all very popular. People know there's a crisis happening and they want to do something. So we identified kind of 5 things that we saw as factors that were driving negative sentiment. First listed here is political leaning. People who are more right-leaning were less supportive of government interventions, as one might expect. In terms of gender, we did see some splits between men and women in terms of support for enforcement. On the kind of perceived causes of homelessness, like I said, those who are focused on drug and alcohol or mental health issues tend to be a little less sympathetic, a little less supportive of positive interventions. Unsheltered homeless population was also a driver of negative sentiment. It was a little bit less of an effect than we expected, right? People are learning from what they see on the streets, so we thought sort of a larger, more outsized presence of street homelessness would amp up negative views. There's a slight effect in that direction, but not as much as we expected. But it does speak to that point that people are forming their views based on what they see. And then finally, our perennial favorite, NIMBY sentiment, which we discussed a bit earlier, and I'll get to in just a second. So here we have, sort of people who said they were left or left-leaning versus people who said they were right or right-leaning in terms of their attitudes on homelessness. And you can really see that gap, especially at the top there. Government should do more to help homeless people, or homeless people should do more to help themselves. As one would expect, those with more right-leaning political views tend to focus more on self-reliance and less on government intervention. Similarly, you see a little bit more NIMBY sentiment and a little bit more sort of quality of life and fear concerns among folks who do identify as more right. Women were a little less punitive and more optimistic. Women were far more likely to think that homelessness can be solved, but they were also more likely to say they felt powerless or fearful when they encountered homeless people. That said, that doesn't translate into more support for enforcement. In fact, men were far more likely than women to support increased policing or harsher criminal laws aimed at homeless people. Addiction perceptions are also driving that backlash. We compared people who focused on financial issues as the primary cause of homelessness versus people who said that addiction was the primary cause of homelessness. Those who focused on addiction were 2 times more likely to support police sweeps of encampments, nearly 2 times more likely to worry about crime caused by homeless people. They were also more likely to oppose affordable housing policies in general, and particularly homeless housing located in their neighborhood. So, there's this obvious link here between those perceptions of addiction and kind of broader NIMBY sentiment. So here we see the smaller effect we're talking about with unsheltered homeless population, right? In areas with more unsheltered people, you do see higher levels of focus on drug and alcohol addiction and mental illness as causes. But you also see just sort of slightly elevated associations with things like danger or crime or nuisance. And again, like we said up front, obviously there's a mixture of positive and negative emotions for the vast majority of people. And so often these people who are worried about crime or nuisance or danger are also very supportive of, things like housing and shelter. But we do see how that presence on the street can end up driving up some negative sentiment and end up sort of paradoxically making it harder to invest in solving this in communities that need it the most. So here we look at people who agreed that all neighborhoods should be involved versus those who think just some neighborhoods should be involved. At a high level, there is a split in support, although the gap on shelters is lower than one might think. But we also specifically asked whether they would support these things in their neighborhood. We see, again, an over 20-point gap there in terms of support. Now, this is very suggestive that there is that NIMBY opposition, but at the same time, even within that, there are lots of people who are supportive. And so not everyone who has these views is going to be, sort of that loud opposition, but it definitely increases the likelihood of that being the case. So now that we've kind of established a little bit about the kind of ground level of where people are currently, the goal here is not just to kind of establish a baseline, but to really understand how we can move public opinion, what kind of strategies we can use to talk to the public in order to effectively improve this conversation, build empathy, and build support for the solutions that we need. So to start, we wanted to know, what's catching people's attention in terms of the messages they're already hearing. And there were kind of 2 types of messages that rise to the top. Again, those that are sad and sympathetic, those that are informative and realistic. Obviously, there is a lot of care to be taken around the presentation of these sad and sympathetic stories. They can end up coming off as voyeuristic. They can end up creating false impressions based on one individual that aren't really systemically applicable. But at the same time, people connect to personal stories. And so we need to figure out kind of how to bridge that gap, how to connect those to the more informative things. Informative and realistic, also interesting to me, right? Realistic is an interesting word here because, like I said, for a lot of people, they're focused on drugs and mental illness. When we talk around those things, they can often tune out because they don't feel like the thing they're seeing is really getting addressed. Maybe they don't really feel like they're getting an honest conversation. And so when we engage on those issues, we need to have a lot of care. So we, on a number of different attributes, tested a series of sort of sample messages. We tried to get a broad range of the kinds of messages people might hear from the homelessness sector in particular, but on homelessness more generally. So some of these are more negative messages. But, as we said up front, there were sort of two types of messages that were really the highest performing. And two of those were really tied to that sense of shared struggle, right? So homelessness can happen to anyone. Homeless people face the same struggles as the rest of us. This is true. I live in Los Angeles, where a lot of people who are not and have never been homeless are really in precarious housing situations, whether that's barely making rent, whether that's doubling up on rooms. And, especially right now when so many people are suffering, and whether that's you personally or just someone someone you're related to who's in a worse situation than they were a year ago, I think this is probably even more resonant than it was when we tested this, about 5 months ago during the survey. The other messages that rose to the top were about health and recovery. People who are homeless face poor mental and physical health outcomes, and people need help with recovery. And I think that also connects back to empathy, right? We live in a country where healthcare can be very hard to access, can be very expensive, can be a giant logistical headache, in addition to obviously all of the very real and grave concerns that can come along with it. And I think that's an area where people are very sympathetic. I think all of us have dealt with a medical bill we didn't expect, or, a series of conversations with an insurance company that we didn't want to have. Kind of the next level of messaging, though, gets back to these bigger systemic points, that homelessness is an economic problem, that it's a systemic problem that requires political solutions, that it's rooted in issues of racism and housing discrimination. And those are very important messages, right? Those are the messages that explain why we need the policies that so many of the people in this room are advocating for. But in some ways, they are secondary to these more sort of direct, personal, and empathetic messages. So again, our task in a lot of ways as people in the homelessness sector who are trying to message to the public is to figure out how to connect those most effective messages back to the most perhaps necessary messages, which are those most systemic points. So like I said, we tested a number of attributes, but across the things we tested, the results were very similar. These messages just continued to rise to the top. So we asked about believability, as well as credibility. We see here that those top messages about shared struggles, about commonality, rose to the top. One thing I found very interesting here, and I just realized I need to move my head so you can actually see it, is system success. So we included a message about, the homeless services sector is succeeding. We are, going to end homelessness. And this is a worrying result for us, right? So often we talk about successes because we're trying to prove that we're effective. And that's important. But at the same time, if we take a too broad view on that, if instead of it's, this project is having this probably modest, impact on our community, very positive, but ultimately it's not sort of the big picture. That has a lot more believability than, we are going to open this thing and we are solving homelessness, because people see it growing. They see what they see on the streets. And if you make that claim too strongly, they are going to tune you out. So other factors that we were interested in, which messages make people feel more likely to support projects, and which ones improve their opinion of homeless people. As we discussed before, there's a lot of ambivalence. There are a lot of fears and concerns, a lack of empathy. And so in addition to kind of the explicit project support, building those relationships and that feeling of comfort between housed and homeless people is very important. And again, we see those same messages really rising to the top. These focus on shared struggles, focus on health. And here we can kind of see the specific problem with success messaging on both credibility and believability. It's, it's about 20 points lower in terms of whether people find it credible or believable compared to every other statement we tested, including the positive and negative statements. This is really a big gap, and one that, like I said, we need to be very careful about making sure we are attentive to. So this is my favorite part. We identified a number of specific audience segments. And essentially, depending on the room you're in, you're going to have a mixture of different people. But in different settings, you're going to want to focus on these different audiences. So the first is our involved advocates who, are invested and want to be part of the solution. Our hesitant helpers who feel a little more uncomfortable, who want to help but don't necessarily know how. The active ignorers who just want to stick their fingers in their ears. And stubborn skeptics who are very concerned about only helping people who deserve it and, are generally going to be more opposed to positive interventions. So we kind of conceptualize this as a way to sort of simplify thinking about these audiences along two axes: empowerment and sympathy. So involved advocates and hesitant helpers, both very sympathetic towards homeless people, right? They both see this as a problem that needs to be solved. On the other end, both the ignorers and the skeptics express less sympathetic opinions and are less invested in solutions. Then there's sort of empoweredness and powerlessness, right? Both the ignorers and the helpers feel like there's not a lot they can do. They don't know how they can be personally involved in solutions. Obviously, they're differentiated by how much they want that involvement, but neither of them really has it. In contrast, both the involved advocates and the stubborn skeptics are already very involved, right? They are willing to speak. They are, talking at public meetings. They are calling in. They are making their voices heard. And so it creates sort of this interesting dynamic, right? Where you have kind of unactivated people, some of whom really can be brought into that, sort of sympathetic group. So our involved advocates, are the most supportive of housing and homelessness prevention policies, the most opposed to criminalization policies, and generally the most comfortable around homeless people. Demographically, they're a little younger, and they're the most likely to be Black compared to other segments. So these are sort of our organic allies, right? If you're, working on a campaign, working on building support for a project, these are the people that you want to bring in. There are folks who want to connect on an individual level and who are kind of already ready to make that move to, being a more active advocate. And this is the audience where we really need calls to action, right? Give people ways to get involved, right? If you've hit someone with a story that is making them feel like this is a huge problem that they want to help solve, you need to give them a way to sort of follow up on that. Yeah. So our hesitant helpers are kind of the soft support, right? Maybe the silent support often if we're talking about these particular pitched battles that we see in so many communities. They're very supportive, but they're personally hesitant. They're more likely than involved advocates to focus more on mental health and addiction and a little bit less on kind of systemic economic issues. They're still opposed to enforcement, and they skew a little bit female demographically. For this group, there's really, the way we framed it was messages about demystifying homelessness, right? These people feel like they were not able to relate to homeless people. And as a result, it can make them sort of hesitant to get involved. And this is another place where telling humanizing, empathetic stories can really make a difference. Next are active ignorers. They are also a little bit younger, a little more male. They're pessimistic about solutions, and they do not support policies that, actively approach this compared to other groups, and really just want to ignore the problem. This group is probably not one you want to necessarily try and engage. They're going to take a lot of effort to reach. They have a really, it's going to be hit or miss whether activating that person will result in creating another part of the opposition or someone who's ultimately going to be on the side of solutions. And so it really makes sense to some extent not to try and put too many resources into reaching a group that just doesn't really want to be involved and, won't stand in your way if you're moving forward either. Finally, our stubborn skeptics. Strongest negative views. They're a little bit older. They're a little bit wealthier. And they are by far the most fearful about quality of life concerns. These are people who are, going to show up and going to be opposed. You're probably not going to win them over. But you do need to address their concerns because they're loud. They speak what they want to say, and they are presenting counter messaging that is almost certainly going to run against whatever advocates are saying. And so there needs to be messaging that frames our approach in a way that accounts for those oppositional issues, right? So framing projects as realistic solutions, not just sympathetic handouts. So based on all of that, we have a few kind of general recommendations, and we can talk a little bit more during the Q&A about some of the specifics. But so first of all, making a human connection is key, right? We need to build empathy. We need to get people feeling like they are connected to homeless people, like homeless people are not sort of other to them. We also need to avoid reinforcing stigma and myths. We do have to address them. As we said, so many people are focused on mental illness and on addiction and on framings that often blame individuals. And we need to engage those, but in ways that don't necessarily reinforce those negative perceptions. We need to uplift voices with lived experience. If we're trying to build empathy, if we're trying to build connection, to show people that they can relate to other people, the easiest way to do that is to let them relate to someone, let someone tell their story. Also being specific, right? Again, tying it to an individual, even if ultimately the point is systemic, can provide an entry point for people who aren't already necessarily thinking of these issues in systemic ways or with like a particularly detailed political analysis of the situation, right? They're starting from that human compassion. When possible, make it interactive. Whether that's a call to action or, getting people to sort of sign up to get informed later, to receive updates on what they can do in their community. If there are ways to kind of bring people into the discussion, that's a really good way to get them engaged and to sort of move them from inactive to active on these issues. As we said before, understand your audience. The group you're speaking to, it may be a group of advocates. It may be a church group who is sympathetic, but hasn't really thought about this issue too much outside of maybe, interacting with a person who sleeps near the church. Alternatively, some meetings are going to be very loud and ugly. And in those, you're going to be more focused on addressing those concerns. And so it's just, it's going to require a lot of sensitivity to context, but it's very important to understand who you're talking to. Collaborate, don't reinvent the wheel. There are so many groups across the country, and probably even in the community that you're working in, that are doing this stuff. And there are so many opportunities to collaborate, and we can often end up reinventing the wheel when really what we need to be doing is joining together, multiplying force, and avoiding redundancy so that we can all be the most effective advocates we can be. And then finally, just giving people easy ways to get involved. Hearing a message about homelessness is one thing, but if that message can translate into action, that can very easily translate to empathy. Just from my own experience, seeing people go out and do direct outreach, it can be a really radicalizing experience just to have those conversations with someone. And with that, we end with this quote about a homeless woman featured on a news story in Minneapolis. She said, "Just because we're homeless doesn't mean we're bad people. That is the truth." Just a very clear and straightforward statement of kind of what we're dealing with and what we need to emphasize, that it's not about individual struggles, that it is about these more systemic issues. And with that, we are moving to the Q&A.
Thank you, Mike. That was really, really awesome. And now you have me, Mike, and Barb for Q&A. So the questions, she sent it to me in a private, so I don't know if she wants this public. But I thought it really related, and Mike and I went back and forth about it a couple of times. So, I don't know if she wants her name that she asked this, but given the timing of this research in the pandemic, do you believe there is longevity in the key messaging around health and recovery, or do you believe that message will resonate less as we move farther away from the pandemic? And I'll quickly start. Mike, I'm sure, has an answer. When we decided to do this, it was at the beginning of the pandemic, and we're wrestling. Do we do it now? Because messaging might be, and public perceptions might be a little different pre or post pandemic. But we decided there's really not a good time. And there's also value in knowing what happens right now. And our hope is to do this messaging every year because of just that. The world changes, but also we're able to establish a benchmark? Mike or Barb?
Yeah, I think from my perspective, obviously I would expect, so the actual surveying was conducted in late August and early September. So, about 5 months into the pandemic. I would guess that does inflate a little bit those focuses on healthcare, but they were still pretty clearly in that top tier. So you might see a little bit of movement in the actual numbers. And the second thing I'd add to that is just that, given the outsized role of mental health and addiction in that public conversation, to me at least, I read that as that being sort of the root of why those messages might resonate with people, right? Because it speaks to their perhaps incorrect or sort of biased perceptions, whether that's accurate to their community or not, but those perceptions are real. And we do need to speak to them. And so I think that was part of why those messages around health and recovery resonated, because they addressed those issues.
Barb, got anything you'd like to add?
I think Mike said it well. The other thing that occurred to me in reviewing the data on that area is that one is we are in a pandemic. So obviously, as Mike said, there's greater sensitivity to health issues. But if we think about where people are getting their information, there is an over coverage of mental health and substance use as it relates to the television media. That's a frequent way they cover the issue of homelessness. And then I also think that, as Mike said in his presentation, just to remember that people draw judgment based on what they actually see. And we can't act like that what they see doesn't actually exist. And so I think having these messages around, it can happen to all of us. We're in this together. The health and recovery, I think those are going to resonate with many of those people. The biggest takeaway I had is that, we're not going to convince everybody, but we don't actually have to convince everybody. So how do we get messages that get to the objectives that we're trying to reach? And I think there's some good nuggets in this idea, these two top messaging ideas.
I know going into the pandemic, it was one of, and this is just me, but it was one of two beliefs that people are going to be more empathetic or they're going to be more selfish. I mean, we saw this with the toilet paper shortage, but it is something that we would definitely want to test more as we benchmark this every year. Another question, not engaging the active ignorers doesn't work for my advocacy work with elected officials. Do you have additional guidance for how to message with them given their decision-making power? And I got to clarify, you're saying the politicians are active ignorers. That's where I'm taking this question from. Mike?
Yeah. So obviously, if you have people in political power who are not seeing the problem or don't want to do anything, that presents a very specific problem, right? Those people are your audience, whether you want them to be or not, because they are ultimately the gatekeepers of getting anything here done. And so I would say that if I were trying to approach a politician who I kind of classified in that way, I think that you need to just start by showing the impact, right? You do have that small slice of people who doesn't see this getting worse or even thinks it's improving already. And, we hear just anecdotally talking to people that people think there are all of these services and housing just available that people aren't taking. And we know that's not the case. And so, I think if you're approaching someone like that, you need to show them the impact. If you can find a way to get them talking to someone who is currently homeless in their, district or their community, I think that's maybe how you can start to kind of to build that, right? They need to see the problem. And, so I think kind of starting from that human impact, and especially if you can sort of, localize it to their community.
I will just add one thing to that real short, is that one of the things that we don't do enough of is we don't repeat. So we do these campaigns and we think, okay, for a week, we're going to have billboards and bus benches and radio ads, or we're going to have homeless people visit, and then we stop. You've got to, repeat the messaging over and over and over again. There's a reason you see that same car ad on TV in the same half an hour several times, is they're trying to drive that messaging into you to buy that car. We have to do the same thing with homeless messaging. We have to repeat it, not just, oh, here, let's message this, and then we're not going to talk about it for a while. So, Barb?
I think one of the things is, always the smart political strategy is count your votes. And if you've got the votes to proceed, then you probably just need to shore up those votes and make sure you're going to vote in the way, because there is the possibility of engaging the active ignorers and getting them escalated. I think all elected officials deserve, standard information. I think it's great if you can build some empathy, but also we don't need 100% vote on most things. And so just being super specific, because you just got to have the votes you need to win. And so adding your political strategy into your messaging strategy and be sure you've got it aligned to get the decisions that you need.
And Elsa, thank you, because we couldn't figure out the question part of this, and because there was chat mode, and when we did it, it put an A, and when you do it, it puts a Q. So now we know it's a question. So thank you. That is awesome. She asked, can you talk about responsible ways to involve the public in outreach related to your talking about figuring out easy ways to get the public involved? Mike, you're an expert in this.
Yeah. So kind of taking off my researcher hat for a second, I also am a co-founder of Ktown for All. We're a Koreatown, Los Angeles group that does a lot of direct outreach each week. We had about 25 to 30 people going out and, doing outreach to a couple hundred people in our community. Obviously that changed during the pandemic, and things are much more tightly managed and limited in terms of capacity now, which has made it harder. So at the moment, it is very hard to responsibly get people involved directly in like a sort of personal one-to-one in real life capacity. And obviously there are big concerns around that. So, a big part of that for us was making sure that every time we went out, we started with a pretty lengthy overview of very specific practices and policies. And those were often things that came from our conversations with unhoused people, like, not going up to a tent and saying, knock, knock, or, come out. That's how cops approach tents. And that can create some real anxiety for people. And it can absolutely make them start from not wanting to engage with them, and so I think we have to find a balance between informing people that there are things you shouldn't do and that there are sensitivities, and you need to be socially graceful in a different social context than the one you're used to. But at the same time, I do think that we need to encourage people to have those conversations, but especially to push back against any kind of savior perceptions. I think when people start out, they can sort of assume that they're going to go out and they're going to talk to someone and then they're going to solve it. And that is unrealistic. And so I think talking with volunteers and really level setting about what, they can do to help and what they aren't going to be able to do is also really important there.
Yeah, I don't know if because I could take the question a couple of ways. How do you get people involved, or how are you responsible when they are involved? And a couple of things that Ktown does great is they use social media to tell the story that what they're doing. And engaging people online. So I believe, as you look at the different audiences, there's some people that are never going to come out, and there's some people who are on the fence. And when you can get those people to go out, and then Ktown is very responsible. They have one of the best, I don't mean to be plugging Invisible People, but there's a documentary we did on them where it highlights the training that they do. And it's one of the best trainings before an outreach that I've ever seen. And they're not social workers. It is completely amazing. For me, I like to involve people by going out and handing out socks. There's a lot of people that would never engage with homeless people, but I make them feel safe. And there's this exchange of a pair of socks. Socks aren't going to end homelessness, but it's that exchange with a person. And then you start talking and engaging and learning the story. So hopefully that answers your question. Barbara, would you like to add anything? Okay, we're going to move on, and hopefully I'm going to pronounce your name right. Rashmi, beautiful name. Forgive me if I didn't pronounce that correctly. And the question is, I have found more success in messaging around family, veteran, or young homelessness, but less so on individual homelessness, because as you pointed out, it seems that personal responsibility. Also, when you talk about Unsheltered and campus, how would you tailor the messaging so that we can connect individual stories to the collective? I will just say, and I'll talk about this in a second if you guys want to go in the invisible people stuff, is you have to research your audience. You have to know the very first step is to figure out what you want people to do, who are those people, and then research what messaging works for them. So like when we did the campaign with Los Angeles with Prop HHH and Measure H, we researched what messaging most influenced people. And you're correct. It was veterans, and it was domestic violence, and it was youth homelessness. And I don't like to cherry pick, but if you're running a campaign to influence people and you know what influences them, you have to include that in your messaging to have a successful campaign.
Sorry, Barb, go ahead.
I was going to say, I just want to acknowledge that I think because of the work we've been doing nationally and the success we're seeing on veterans homelessness, on family homelessness, and as we put children front and center, like in some ways we are victims of our own messaging, where we are putting forth what we believe to be the most sympathetic and will kind of catch the public's attention. What I've been interested in seeing communities promote more is there are lots of nuances around the lives of people who are experiencing homelessness but aren't veterans, aren't coming with children. And we need to be able to share more of their stories, their struggles, but also the ways that they're able to overcome their situations in a positive way, and put more nuance on that, because I think the population of single adults with a broad brush is generally demeaned in all types of things. If we think about our social policy structures that we work in, there's not usually public assistance for unemployed single adults. There's a lot of biases against single people being able to access even basic health insurance or Medicaid or that. So we're really running up against public perceptions about the so-called unworthiness of single adults who aren't caring for children. And I think in the work that we're doing, we're going to have to be able to explain more and humanize. And again, the best way to do this is from that lived expertise, that speaking their stories in respectful ways, but also making sure that we connect the dots around how public policies that support recovery, that support re-engagement in the employment sector, that make a difference for this population and the positive roles that they contribute in the community. And I just think that for our sector, we have not done that population well, because that population is the one we tend to feature on the Thanksgiving announcement that they need to be fed. And we try to make this connection between if you feed people, they won't be homeless anymore. And so there's just a lot of work that's been done in the past that we actually need to overcome the bad messaging we did and shift to more messages about how these are our brothers or sisters, and by working together, we can make an impact in here. I'm going to pass it off to Mike because it looks like you've got some else to add into it.
Yeah, I definitely want to second Barb's point that's a two-part problem, right? Because on the one hand, it can be harder to message about single adults, but on the other hand, there just aren't services available for them in many cases, right? Recently, there was a story in LA of someone being in an interim shelter for 2 years because they were a 50-ish-year-old man, and there were essentially no kind of outplacement opportunities from that interim situation. But in terms of, kind of our role as storytellers or as messengers or advocates or whatever sort of part of this we play, I think that there are aspects to stories that we can emphasize, right? So if that is, a single adult man who's perhaps the least eligible for services if they're not a veteran, right? There are still going to be aspects of that story that are important, that speak to systemic issues, that are able to connect to the public, right? Maybe that's being evicted from the neighborhood that you've been living in for 10 years, right? Maybe that's, the story of losing how you, lost a parent and then lost your job because of the grief and then found yourself unable to pay your rent. And with, no family left to go, rely on. And so I think finding those stories and telling them and then, connecting them back to that lack of solutions, right? And I think this speaks to another question that I saw, but we hadn't been able to explicitly answer, which is, how does sort of collaboration work alongside criticism? And I think that's a careful line to walk. Sometimes that means addressing things privately instead of publicly. But, I think that we can also just speak to the fact that there aren't a lot of options available for single people, right? Like, it's very easy in the short term for us to focus on the most sympathetic populations, to build programs for families and to build programs for veterans. And those are very important. But if we focus too much on that, it can end up creating this perception of deserving versus undeserving people. So I think part of it is finding the stories to tell about the single people, but another part of it is being a little bit more reserved about.
Uh-oh. Mike froze on us. Hopefully he'll come back. But Mike skipped ahead.
A lot of ways in which we're.
Well, he's going. You froze on us.
Oh, sorry about that. Was just finishing on obviously, like, we have a lot of work still to do dealing with families, dealing with veterans. We see that on the streets in our own neighborhood. But I think if we sort of lapse back to the most sympathetic stories and to the most exceptional individuals, that we can end up reinforcing that message that some people are deserving and some people are not, and that kind of ends up potentially kind of creating some blowback for the kind of solutions that we all need.
And you skipped ahead. You went up a couple. So we'll get back to you, Eric. I think that's an important one. I was ready, but I was also excited about this question because it's very real. And I got it. Just the way nonprofits are formed, we're all fighting for the same scraps. It's hard for us to collaborate. And if you've been around the homeless sector for a while, I remember when CES, coordinated entry, first was introduced. I was a worker in Los Angeles, and we all could not, all we wanted was a single unified intake form. But the people working with veterans wanted it and the youth wanted it, and it was really hard. But eventually we all came together. So my answer to this is, it's not going to be easy, but if you look at the messaging that the public receives, which I opened up with, it's all over the place. And, no wonder the public's confused, or detached. And no wonder we don't have the support for housing solutions that we need. So I love your question. I like Mike's response. Maybe Barb has this response to that too. But mine is, we've got to figure out a way of coordinating our messaging, just like we're working on coordinating our services. Okay, nothing to add? We'll go on. So Eric asked, how do you recommend walking the line messaging with hesitant helpers that address their concerns about drug and mental health without reinforcing the stigma? Again, these are great questions, everybody, against those that correlate with lower support for solutions. Great question. I'm glad this come up, and there is no easy way to balance this. It is a challenge. I am proud. If you look at our last mini documentary, we went on the streets with Dr. King in Venice. And if you know some of the history of what's going on in Venice Beach, is you have a very strong, stubborn supporters, hesitant helpers community. They're very loud. And for us to not talk about addiction and mental health, they would have immediately said, oh, this isn't authentic. This is not real. So we had to talk about it. So if you watch the video, we go head on into addiction and mental health and senior homelessness, but throughout we're messaging housing as a solution. So this is just one real example for me and Invisible People, and we've been doing this for 12 years. You know, I take it on a case-by-case basis. I think if we're going to back to collectively, one thing I've been pitching forever is that we go for a unified national campaign and, message homelessness correctly to the public for an extended period of time. But until that happens, I do our messaging on a case-by-case basis. And me and the producer looked at it and we said, gosh, do we put this in? How do we put this in? And we came to the conclusion that by avoiding the conversation of mental health and addiction, that it would actually hurt what we're trying to say. But if you message it authenticity, I mean, if you didn't get anything else from the research, it's just be real. It's just be authentic, be honest with people. I mean, when we're saying, we have to talk about successes, whether they're baby steps or large successes. But my recommendation is say, we're doing better than we've ever have, but there's still much more work to be done and we need your help. So when you're just messaging success, hey, look, we've got these 49 people in the housing. That's great. And you need to celebrate, but you also have to message it in a way, or I suggest messaging it in a way where you let people know that, we got a lot more to do. And this is just one piece of a much bigger strategy.
Yeah. To add to that a little bit, from my own experience doing advocacy, I find that when I'm in conversations like that, the tack that I found to be most effective is a sort of very strict utilitarianism, right? To try and get away from judgment and instead talk about results, right? So, for example, right, if someone loses their housing, that is not going to make them use less meth or less heroin or whatever it is, even if addiction was contributing as a cause to that. Being on the street, there are people who, for example, massively increase their take of stimulants because they are legitimately fearful that they will be the victims of violence, right? And I think talking about those things in a realistic way can be very valuable there. Similarly, on the solution side, right? Someone is far more likely to stick with addiction treatment if they have a place to go afterwards, right? If they're going back to a tent after going to an AA meeting, it's going to be a lot harder to keep up with your sponsor, to keep up with doing the steps, and to have a successful recovery, right? And so, obviously we do some of that when we talk about housing first, especially, right? And we talk about wraparound services, but often those are very, sort of tertiary messages. They're very, kind of not the key message. But, when you're addressing audiences that have those concerns, I think you need to just very forthrightly kind of almost in a Socratic way, be like, all right, so if we don't house people who have addictions and are already living on the street, what happens to them? And we know what happens to them because that's mostly what we've done in response to that, right? We let people languish on the streets, and that doesn't make them stop being addicted. It does not make them have better mental health outcomes. And so, I think we need to sort of constantly frame the sort of housing solutions and the systemic economic issues as related to that. And in fact, really the only real solution to the underlying issues that drive those problems.
I think those are all great points. One of the things I've been thinking about is if we looked at the top or the high performing messages, as they were called in the deck, and local communities took these 4 messages and then look in kind of the middle group of ones that worked okay, but had some other content into it, it would be really great to see the decision makers and in public as well as nonprofit sectors kind of get around the table and talk about how you can have even a low key approach to dealing with the media. Like what if your goals were, what were the kind of stories that we could give to TV media to talk about homelessness that fall within these messages and really provide some education? Because TV is always looking for stories, and usually they're going to call you up this is my bias, they would call me up with the dumbest story idea ever, and I would then try to make lemonade out of their dumb story idea. So, but I never thought about proactively thinking through what a series of messages might be that we wanted and how we could tell that story and tell it in a collective way that cuts across the public and the private sector. Include your philanthropic partners as well. They have some kind of vehicles out there. And really, I don't think it has to be a high cost effort, but some level, because through this research, what has been tested is, we know from the national research what are the highest performing messages. So why not just use them and try it? I think there's more local research that probably needs to get done. I'm certainly not an expert in this. But I think there's enough content here that you could take it locally and start making some progress together without having to know everything. I am always guilty of making things way more complicated than they need to be. And the more complicated they are, the harder it is to kind of lift it off. So let's just try to do some simple things, because those news stories are really powerful. Like, it shocked me how much people depend on the public or on the TV news to get their information. And then the second piece is, obviously, I know those of you working on addressing homelessness, you're trying to make your streets and your public places and, be more accommodating so they have less negative stories in there. But I think that's where the strategies Mike is talking about with Ktown, how they're doing some direct engagement and doing that in ways that are positive to the individuals who are on the streets, as well as getting better information to kind of concerned citizens. So those are two directions I would think about taking.
And I want to play a little bit off of Barb, one thing she said, and I'm glad she reminded me of something else. So this was a very broad research nationally, and we did the best we could with the resources we had. If you're going to do it locally, if you have the resources to do it locally, I recommend that. If you don't have the resources, even for Prop HHH and Measure H, I have some friends that I'm not going to tell you which category they're in, but they're very honest with me. And I will bounce messages off them. They live in Los Angeles. Or when I was producing television, I once did an infomercial for a college. And I walked around for a week asking all the students, why did you come here? And then I took the top 3 reasons and made, message that in an infomercial and broke all the records. So there's ways to do that. You got to understand there's a bias of some people you got to find people that are honest, right? That are going to tell you exactly what they think. But you don't have to fund major research to test messaging. The other thing is, and Barb was exactly right. So in Los Angeles, one of the things I did when I was at a homeless shelter in Glendale is reporters, journalists have a job to do. So if you can give them an easy button, and there's normally 2 types of nonprofits, ones that are very closed communication wise, and you have to have policies. I'm not saying a communication policy for an organization is a bad thing, but some of them so rigid that the reporters go, I'm never going to call them again. And so what I did is I reached out to all the reporters that were going down to Skid Row. I knew that they probably didn't want to go down to Skid Row. We were a family shelter. I know they want families because it makes for a better story. And I said, look, it's easy peasy. You just let me know and we will help you get stories. And that worked. There's a gentleman that Barb also knows up in Syracuse, New York, that he just live streams on his Facebook. And because reporters are always looking for stories, and John is willing to help them get that story, and they see him on Facebook Live all the time, he dominates. And I know he has zero marketing budget. He dominates the local news compared to other organizations. Real quick, we're going to go for another 15 minutes. We're not going to go. This conversation is important. It's great. I'm not going to go into invisible people stuff. That was just an add-on. I can do that later. If we don't get to your question, please email me, contact me, and we'll do the best we can to answer. If you like this, we can possibly do more of it. Let us know. But we'll go for another 15 minutes. And I just apologize. Some of the questions you guys are asking, the greatest questions, we might not be able to get to.
Is it okay if I address one that?
Yeah. Go, Mike. I was just going to say, Mike, why don't you pick one?
Cool. So someone in the chat, I want to say it was Eric, although now I can't actually find the original message, had asked about sort of other demographic factors. We talked a little bit about gender and political leaning. So we did ask an extensive battery of demographics, including things like religious views, income, education level, sexuality, a few others, children and household, right? And, we looked pretty closely at the data along those lines. And, I had actually expected age to be a bigger factor, but I think that might just be a little bit of ageist bias on my part in retrospect, because the differences were really small and smaller than I would have expected. We did see some differences with income, although again, kind of smaller and a little bit sort of U-shaped. But yeah, the demographics that we show are the ones where we saw a real difference. So in general, those, at least in our sample, those demographics had less of an impact than one might expect. But I think that was a great question, so thank you.
You want to pick another?
Apologies, that was Marco's question that I just answered. Let's see. Trying to find another one.
Well, while you're waiting, you queue one up. I'm going to answer Gina. Oh, Gina's private, so you didn't even see it. So good thing. My question is similar to Eric. How do we talk about intersection or not between addiction and homelessness? And my only thought is we actually all addicted to something. And, I've done that. Hey, how's your diet going? Do you like chocolate cake? Are you easy to put it down? I don't think that messaging actually works so well. I really do my best, and this is something we should unpack and test specifically. This one question, I would love to unpack more research and test messaging on this. But what I try to do is talk about it as authentically as possible, but show the person, and that people abuse drugs to escape pain. And I'm an addict. And I know from my own experience with people that are what we call normies, they could not understand addiction. And there's a point where drugs take over. So many people just believe that they're a drug addict, they're criminals. And we have to go back and say, you know what? That person was abused at 5 years old, or whatever that pain is that they're trying to escape. So the quick response to your question is we need to humanize the addict, or humanize that person with mental illness, and in such a way that it builds empathy, and that way you change perceptions.
Yeah, one thing I would recommend to sort of look to on that issue in particular is kind of the harm reduction community, and shout out to any of you who might be here still, because the harm reduction folks are some of my favorite. But the thing that I really think is effective about what they do is just talking in a way that is very plain and straightforward, and sort of demoralize. That's the wrong word. That means something else, but sort of removing the morality aspect of it from the discussion, and just talking very concretely and groundedly about the realities. And obviously that's not going to work for everyone. There are folks who are always going to hear a phrase like safe injection site and immediately be like, no, right? But we do live in a reality where we've tried a lot of prohibitionist strategies that have completely failed. And so I think, again, grounding that discussion in the realities that we face and in the failures we've already seen can often be the best way to get someone to think a little bit differently about the kinds of solutions that they might be willing to embrace.
And don't waste your time on an audience that's never going to change their mind.
I think there is also some value in just saying, yes, addiction, mental illness are occurring frequently among people experiencing homelessness. And what I find really alarming is for many people, these issues didn't show up until they were on the street and had nowhere to go. And so I have learned to understand that addiction and mental health are both a cause and a consequence of homelessness. And what we know is that everyone benefits when we get them to a safe, stable place and they can improve their recovery and their odds of getting out of it. So it's not to minimize it, but it's like you can't go too far down the rabbit hole of a judgment around it. And I can even go so far as to say, yes, I know I have family members who struggle with mental illness and have struggled with addiction, and I know how hard it is. But I know there's a road to recovery, and I know that road to recovery involves having a safe, stable place to be. And that's why I'm working so hard in our community or our country to make safe housing part of the path to recovery. And it's hard to kind of argue with that. Like I haven't had anybody then argue because I've agreed with them and I've shared some additional information.
I got a private message, and this might be the last one, but it's a good one. And if we can do more, we'll do more. This is a really good one. What do you think of the tension of the most effective messaging of the truth moral story to tell? Bringing this up because there has been recent research on best messaging to not mention race and inequality around homelessness. Rather, all of us face economic insecurity. Thoughts on that balance and or occlude for next year's research questions to focus groups. Great question. I know from my own experience, whenever I try to message that homelessness is racism, I get a lot of pushback. And I think, I don't know of the messaging, the recent research. If you can email me or let me know, I have not seen that. But it is definitely something that we should do a deep dive in, just that particular messaging, because racism and how our Black, brown, and Native friends are disproportionate in homelessness, and it's caused by racism, is an important topic. So this is a key messaging that I would love to unpack.
Yeah, I think that is a real problem, and particularly with respect to race. Like, again, I am all about thinking about the background that we are speaking against. And in this case, it is that we live in a white supremacist culture. And that is a big problem, right? And that can make it very easy if someone says, I am homeless as a result of housing discrimination against me because I'm Black. A lot of people are going to hear that message and be like, no, this is your fault. That's not real. And that's obviously false, but it is a real dynamic that we have to think about. And I think this is actually one case where, sort of going towards a more systemic explanation can actually be really helpful, right? There is a ton of good research and work and, sort of journalism adding to that, and sort of public discussion, around these historical issues of redlining, of divestment in Black communities, right? And of, these kind of historic and still in many cases still standing issues of, housing specifically in the Black community, but in minority communities in America more broadly, and that extends obviously to 2008 and this massive decrease we saw in Black homeownership, right? And so I think that in those conversations, because we can have such a tendency to both individualize racism and then once it is individualized to then just deny or ignore it, that is a case where it's even more important to tie those specific stories back to those big systemic issues, right? So, someone who perhaps did lose their housing in the 2008 crash and can speak to that, and then connecting that to that broader story that had a really outsized impact on minority communities compared to white communities, but despite being this massive society-wide crisis. We see the same thing with COVID, right? And so, I think there are real opportunities to sort of reinforce a systemic perspective, because especially with racism compared to, say, maybe issues of income or class, right, there is a vast tendency to, individualize it, to reduce it down to just sort of like slurs and bad attitudes. And like, that is not the case. We know that's not the case. And that's kind of a a battle that we have to fight even before we get to the discussion of how housing discrimination still impacts homelessness.
Barb, got anything to add?
No, I just want to say I think it's an important issue. And I think in this polarized environment that we're in, it's important to find the ways to talk about this that bring together the momentum we need to solve homelessness. And I think there's definitely more work, both on dismantling the structure, the racist structures, but also how we talk about this in relationship to homelessness and moving us towards solutions. So I think more to come in this space is going to be needed.
Yeah.
And RD, we'll end with RD's, and thank you, RD, for joining us. RD, I won't go into the RD story, but we got long history. I originally helped her over social media. She was homeless, and I saw her tweet, and I think I was in Mississippi or Minneapolis, one of the M states, and I was able over social media to help her at that particular time. But RD brought up the immigration issue, and I have a unique funnel into what the public thinks because, we get millions of views every month in YouTube comments, and YouTube comments are often nasty, but I get to see what the public thinks often in real time, the nasty stuff. And it was interesting, and I won't go political here, but there was a climate in this country where the immigration comments were prevalent, very strong. And then they went away, and now they are back. So I know with our news, we publish news 5 days a week. We have tried to counter that. It's not really reaching the demographics, the audiences that really need to change their mind. It's more so to give us talking points because it is something that people just, there's some people that just automatically say, oh, we're giving free homes to the people crossing the border. Why can't we help our own? And that drives me crazy because it's just, anyways. So good question.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Mike.
Oh, I just wanted to say how much I appreciate that comment. I think we did ask about kind of immigration status, like whether they were native born or not. But I don't think we really got into sort of the intersection of views there. And, having seen similar comments to the one Mark was describing, I think that's a really good thing to flag and definitely something that we'll consider, if and when we kind of do a follow-up on this.
Oh, so we're going to do a follow-up. Oh, Barb, do you got something to add? So this is the band right here, and we're going to do a follow-up. There's a couple other people that helped us, and we're grateful for everybody. And I didn't even, when I first started talking to Mike about this, I didn't know if I was able to, be able to fund it or make it happen, but we did, even during the pandemic and an election year. So we're going to be much more organized and planned ahead this year. And in Invisible People style, we're very scrappy and quick. So we do excellent work quick, and we're going to do that again this year. So I want to thank Mike because Mike was really the star of the show. Barb is, she has helped Invisible People and this research and this conversation today so much I really don't have words. Addie stuck with us. Derek had a little crisis in the tent camp, so he had to bail. You guys are real. We call them troll zappers on our live stream, but there's no trolls here. I just wanted to include them because they're awesome. And whenever I go live, they're always our monitors. If we weren't able to get to your question, I'm sorry. If you do want Invisible People tips and tricks, maybe I'll produce something. Let me know. Send me an email and we can get it up for you. But this was going a little long. I didn't want to go longer than an hour and a half. And the questions were really, really good. So I would rather talk about messaging than talk about Invisible People. Go, Mike.
Oh, I was just going to say we've had a couple questions in the chat about whether this will be up or like how to access a recording of this. And I was wondering if you could just speak to that real quick.
So hopefully, crossing fingers, it all recorded, and we are going to see, because I'll be very transparent and candid, the poll function, which Mike and I worked on, and Barb gave some recommendations for a couple of days. I did not know how to operate it because we didn't test it in real time. So I don't think the response is saved, but let's hope the video saved. If not, we'll do this again sometime. And I greatly appreciate all of you guys' support, because for the 50 people that are still here, or it was up to almost 130 people at one time, you're the core group that have got to go to your organizations and your circle and, talk about, hey, we need to message effectively. We need to really get this done. We need to work on public and political perceptions. So that's all I've got.
Just a quick plug. If you're in the LA area and you want to come to an event in 24 minutes about FEMA money and the city of Los Angeles and demanding that Eric Garcetti ask for the reimbursements the city's owed, we will be at 6th and Irving in about 24 minutes. So if you can make it, feel free to come by. It's going to be very fun.
And I got to add on to it. I mean, they did like what's the mailing house thing where you get free money. I mean, they are taking political events to a whole new level of fun.
We're just following in a grand tradition of political theater. But anyway, thank you all for joining us. This was really, really fun, and I really appreciate all the great questions.
Thank you, everybody.